Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 41 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of, the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, consider becoming a subscriber or follower on Substack, or a one-time supporter on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or Ko-Fi. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. So, hi, welcome. I will apologize in advance. I have a cold, so I have a little bit of a cough again. So, apologies for that. This week, because of the Christmas holiday here in the U.S., there's only 2 articles to go over this week, so this will be a shorter than normal, maybe. Podcast, and it will be also released, as you could probably tell by the time you get it, a little bit later than normal. So the 2 papers this week were the Nuclear Warfare Policy, Cold War to Today, Part 3, and the West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 23. So first one to talk about is the Nuclear Warfare Policy, Cold War to Today, Part 3. And we're going to talk about Presidential Directive NSC, National Security Council Directive number 59, this is going to be part 2 of NSC 59. Not to confuse that this is part 3 of the Nuclear Warfare Policy series. The NSC 59 will actually be a 3-part series. The third and final section will be coming out next week, and then there's actually some subsections and I think a congressional hearing review on it that will follow up next, and then we'll start moving into something outside of NSC 59. So NSC 59 was President Carter released it under what was called Presidential Directive 59 or NSC 59 in July 1980, and it was a work in progress, but a culmination of what was outlined in NSC 18 in 1977. If you want to read more about NSC 18, that is actually part 1 of the nuclear warfare series. And, excuse me, sorry. The directive to go through to start in NSC 59, and this was not specifically named, but it was mentioned in NSC 18. But last week we talked about 3 high-level targeting objectives: counter force and counter value, and those were existing targeting objectives for strategic nuclear forces. And then President Carter added something that was called countervailing. Now, counter force is when you're attacking in this case, let's talk about the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union attacking the U.S. Counterforce is attacking the nuclear strategic assets of the other country, like attacking ICBM silos, or if you could catch them, SLBM submarine bases, bomber bases. That is your counterforce. Also, it can include some high-level economic objectives. But for the most part, think of it as attacking the country's nuclear forces, strategic nuclear forces. Counter value, that is cities. That is the primary backbone of mutually assured destruction. That is attacking the countries, cities, and other industries that help keep a society running. And so that was a major part of MAD, was to go after mutually assured destruction, was to go after these counter value targets, basically holding each other's population and society as hostage to a nuclear attack. And that was the primary backing of deterrence. So that's counter value. And then the one that President Carter created under his administration was called countervailing. And this was kind of more of a hybrid approach to going after the things that are held most important to the political leadership of, in this case, the Soviet Union, and what they valued in society and how they maintained control of their society, and putting that under threat. So that was countervailing. So all these were covered last week in part 2, which was actually the most popular paper that I have written in Substack. Part one didn't do great. Part three, not so good either. I mean, it did okay, but not as well. But part two actually did better than any other of the, and that was part one of NSC 59. So I guess maybe the sequel doesn't do as well as the original. I guess we would say that. But remember, counterforce, countervalue, and countervailing. When we're talking about strategic nuclear forces, not tactical nuclear forces, strategic. These all strategic targeting falls into the idea of counterforce, countervalue, and countervailing. Again, this was covered in part one of NSC 59, which is, again, part two of Cold War and Today series. So just always remember, everything that's targeted in strategic nuclear targets in the United States falls under counterforce, countervalue, and countervailing. So the directive calls for updating. This is, once we get in there, talk about the counterfeits, is now you're going into actual, some of the targeting conversations of how to make decisions on how to focus on your attacks on counterforce, countervalue, and countervailing. And the directive calls for updating the pre-planned options of what's called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP. And that has been around, again, pre-Carter, still around today. It is, I think I put in my paper that it was something that a journalist and a military historian, and I would call him an anti-nuclear activist. Now he's a climate change, I don't know, let's just say fanatic. Always been a he's very good, his military or journalist and historian. He did serve in the military. He is somebody worth listening to, but he always falls on the doom side of everything. And in the case of in the Cold War, he was a very anti nuclear war person, and his name was Gwynne Dyer. And he's actually he doesn't call himself Canadian. He calls himself a Newfoundlander, but Canada, and so. But he lives in the UK, and he said the PSYOP was, he called it the traffic, basically the traffic coordination of all the West nuclear weapons under the US, UK, and France. Basically, it is so that the use of nuclear warheads were used efficiently, make sure all targets were covered, so on and so forth. So it was basically the traffic. I think he called the traffic pattern for nuclear weapons. So that's the PSYOP. Now, the PSYOP is something that's made in advance, and this is kind of the point when I start writing these papers, is President Putin of Russia has made a big deal about changing the nuclear policy of Russia. Excuse me. And my point is, it is harder than just making that announcement. I'm starting to walk into that as a real world example. Remember, NSC 18, which started implementing updates, including countervailing, and also the idea of limited nuclear war, was outlined in 1977. And it wasn't until 1980 that they got to a point that they felt like they could actually start implementing these plans. So the Russians to come up and say, hey, we've changed our targeting, is either they did not fully vet it, they don't have the infrastructure, both military planning and weapons-wise, the ability to do it, or it has always been this, and now they're just making it public. Don't know, but the fact that you can't go into a couple weeks, come out with a press conference and say, hey, we've changed everything, it is not likely. So again, not saying the Russians haven't done it, but either they haven't done it yet, or it was always in the part of their strategic planning, and now they're just talking about it. So the PSYOP, again, sets up with pre-planned targeting of the Soviet Union based on the scenario that is being provided. Again, based on those high-level targeting objectives, counterforce, countervalue, countervailing. So the PSYOP has these pre-planned decisions based on some scenario. And it could be a scenario like a war in Europe. Again, we're talking about the Warsaw Pact and NATO fighting. It could be Persian Gulf under the Carter Doctrine, where the Persian Gulf was a strategic asset to the United States and the West, worth defending. Could have been an attack on Japan. Um, so there obviously was pre-planned scenarios, and based on whatever the scenario was, and it could be like the idea of building up to a nuclear force, like it could be the idea of moving away from the MAD doctrine. Again, this was a big part of NSC 18. Again, the idea of, as I stated, a limited nuclear war was pre-Carter, but he really started formalizing the idea of the limited nuclear war. So the PSYOP could actually lay in and say, okay, it's based on, for the one scenario is, okay, conventional war breaks out in Europe, breakthrough of Soviet forces. Okay, we have to have a limited nuclear attack to, I don't have any news of this, so or I don't have any information on this. I'm going to just make a scenario up. 5 nuclear weapons attack Warsaw, Leningrad, Moscow, or outskirts of it, and make a demonstration of, okay, you need to back off from your conventional forces advancing in Europe. So maybe that's a pre-planned targeting situation. It says if A happens, the plan 1 is implemented. If B happens, plan 2 is implemented. And it could also be is if you do plan 1, A happens and plan 1 is implemented, but it doesn't change anything. You go to plan 2. So you got a sequential series of pre-planned events, pre-planned targeting. Again, based on counterforce, countervalue, and countervailing. So you have the pre-planned option. So there's obviously have to go in there and make updates to it. And it also is if the war was to include, were the United Kingdom's nuclear weapons available, or the French nuclear weapons available, or both of them available, or none at all. So those are all those pre-planned scenarios that have to basically come up from the Strategic Air Command's the people that developed the PSYOP. It also fell into the Navy's role as well, because the Navy's included in the PSYOP. So you have those pre-planned targeting scenarios. And so the idea is that, again, you have to have requirements including a developing effective retaliatory strikes, creating adaptable sub-options. This is reading from the text of the material. And ensuring sufficient strategic forces capable of attacking urban and industrial targets, which is counter-value. So here you go in there, and it's like, here you can see that we're already, just reading this, you've already extended beyond the idea of mutually assured destruction. If a nuclear attack happens, you just go ahead and go all out in what was called a nuclear spasm, and you just release everything, and just everything goes up in smokes in one big turn. Now you can see here when you read this particular wording, requirements included developing effective retaliatory strikes. Now, obviously, a retaliatory strike, if the Soviets did a first strike against the United States, obviously there would be a retaliatory strike, preferably launch on warning. I say preferably, hopefully this never had happened, but it would never happen, is launch on warning. Is those Russian ICBMs or submarine launched ballistic missiles are on their way. And before the impact, you fire off your missiles to before the impact of the Soviet weapons. That's called launch on warning. It was often called move 'em or lose 'em theory of nuclear warhead or warfare. So you're not going to wait for the Soviets' ICBMs to land before you decide to initiate your own attack option. The PSYOP included these ideas of launch on warning and scenarios. So again, we're talking about not a nuclear spasm as, okay, here comes the Soviet ICBMs. We're just going to launch everything and destroy Russia. They will probably destroy us in return, because at this point, deterrence has failed, because, again, we're talking about mutually assured destruction. Just by reading this, effective retaliatory strikes, creating adaptable sub-options, and ensuring sufficient strategic forces capable of attacking urban and industrial targets. So this obviously is going in there and mentioning, in between the lines, is it is extending beyond the idea of mutually assured destruction. Now, as I said in the first paper, is mutually assured destruction is still a legitimate goal under the PSYOP and under the Carter administration. What he was doing through NSC 18 and NSC 59, and some of this have predated Jimmy Carter, President Carter, is the idea is they wanted some other options besides just blowing up the world. And that's actually, I think, a quote from Gwen Dyer as well. So we're getting into the formalization of the idea of a limited nuclear war, or even an escalatory nuclear war, is that you have steps of escalation leading all the way up to when all else is given up, you have sufficient strategic forces capable of attacking urban and industrial centers. Basically, just destroy all that makes a society, which are its people. So that's the idea, is that eventually is that even when you go through this escalatory move of, and knowing that you're going to take strikes in return, meaning that the Russians are just, or the Soviets are not going to sit by and let us bomb at will, where obviously they're going to start trying to destroy our assets as well, threaten our assets, is that even if you get in this tit for tat type exchange with the Soviets in an escalatory nuclear environment, you still have to hold sufficient strategic forces capable of attacking those. And those are mainly submarines, because at the time, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, at the time that this document was created, the Polaris missile and the Trident 1 C4 missile, I believe is what it's called, were not accurate enough to destroy ICBMs. You had to have a relatively accurate ICBM to land on top of a reinforced nuclear silo. So even with a nuclear weapon, you had to still come relatively close to incapacitate those silos. You didn't necessarily have to destroy it, but if you could do the same where you could keep the door, the blast protective door, from opening, you have basically removed that ICBM from being able to launch against the Soviet Union. So the SLBMs to attacking urban and industrial targets, maintaining sufficient strategic forces, they are talking about, they meaning the leadership are creating the PSYOP, are talking about submarines, those invulnerable submarines that you can't find, but they don't attack accurately enough to attack bomber bases or to attack ICBMs. They are dedicated to city destruction. They are the ones that go in there, often they're considered second strike weapons, because again, they don't have the accuracy at the time to be able to make those types of attacks on ICBMs. So it is, part of it is those submarines were basically basically a hostage type situation on the Soviet Union and its allies' population. So on top of that, PD 59 asked for, within the PSYOP, was it wanted more options and sub-options. So it just didn't want, hey, we're just going to go right to mutually assured destruction. It wanted to have more options available to the president and the National Command Authority on how to target and how to approach nuclear warfare. Again, the underlying tone, without saying it is developing into the idea of a limited nuclear war. And a limited nuclear war was in the writing in PD 18 and PD 59 was the idea is it had to end on terms favorable to the U.S. Not necessarily winning, because even Caspar Weinberger and Ronald Reagan had said, Caspar Weinberger was the Secretary of Defense for Ronald Reagan. Obviously, Ronald Reagan was the next president after Carter. The idea is that a nuclear war, no matter how limited, was unwinnable, was not a winning situation. But the idea is that, hey, you got to create these options to be able to open up something available to end the war on conditions favorable to the U.S. So on top of just updating the PSYOP with more pre-planned scenarios, it also wanted to have, and again, the idea was that flexibility within an inflexible plan basically is create options and sub-options for how to react to certain scenarios, but they would be fixed. So The next part is PD 59 asked for enhance the flexibility of U.S. strategic nuclear forces beyond the pre planned options of the PSYOP and enabling quick creation and implementation of such plans. Now, so even when the Soviets or the Russians currently, like Vladimir Putin says, hey, if when he changes his plans, says, hey, a lot more things are open up for nuclear war or nuclear attack by their strategic forces, is he's talking about something about here enhanced flexibility that the U.S. has beyond the pre-planned options. Again, enabling quick creation and implementation. That is basically what the Russians are doing. Now, the idea is, though, when President Carter created this, is there had to be enhanced staffing networks, like actual people to help with the pre-planning of determining what targets and what defines victory. So this was supposed to be something quick, and like if something happened, I don't know, is let's say China, not China today. Think about China in 1985 with only about 150 or so nuclear weapons, decided to attack the United States, or maybe attack South Korea with its nuclear weapons. That may not have been in the PSYOP. So the idea is that the U.S. has to be able to have the ability to create rapidly create a new nuclear plan and to determine what is the objective of that particular plan. So the idea is to create enhanced flexibility. And the idea is it had to have intelligence collection, and it had to have the technical and communications to C3, call it the command, control, and communications, had to have that network established that could be able to withstand the idea, have enough redundancy to withstand an attack from the Russians, let's say in a first strike, and we're going through some form of limited nuclear war, is you had to have the ability to do this. And the other part, again, staff. There was staff had to be done at the unified and specified commands, which includes theater level commands. Let's say NATO. The unified command structures like the Strategic Air Command and the National Command Authority and Intelligence and Target Development. All of these had to have staffing options to be able to rapidly create new plans of attack using nuclear weapons. So this, excuse me. So this kind of goes in the heart of what President Putin, when he sits there and says, we've done this, is even in the President Carter's idea. So he lays this out, and the outline comes out in 1977. He brings this out in 1980. He does not even in 1980 have this fully implemented that, hey, for us to create more flexibility outside the pre-planned options and sub-options of the PSYOP, we have to have staffing at all different levels, at the unified command levels, the theater commands, the National Command Authority, Intelligence, and Target Development, all have to have staff available to make these plans available. And again, we're talking about strategic nuclear forces, not theater level nuclear forces. The idea is bringing in theater commands. NATO, for example, NATO command led by an American, is maybe there's a breakthrough in West Germany, and the response was not necessarily to create, like I just mentioned earlier, is not necessarily to use tactical nuclear weapons inside West Germany, because that's our friends, and you don't want to attack West Germany with a nuclear weapon. Maybe you decide that no, maybe the strategic nuclear weapons attacks Warsaw or something that's beyond the range of the theater level, but it's also the theater level is the one that's helping pick targeting in this. So that's the idea is that even the theater level has to have that option of coordinating with the National Command Authority through staffing and targeting of how to use U.S. strategic nuclear weapons to attain a goal within the theater. So this sounds a lot like what President Carter had said. So I said it takes 3 years from the time that they started creating this to the time they go, and then to throw on top of that, he set a timeline of 1982 to be able to get those staffing levels up to those levels to be able to meet that. So you're talking 5 years. And at that point, not even fully implemented. Of course, Jimmy Carter lost the November 1980 election, and so we never knew. But just basically passed on to President Reagan, and they made modifications, which we will discuss at a later point. So again, the idea is it takes 5 years from the concept to the idea of creating something was until 1977 created. 1982 was full implementation, or what they hoped was full implementation. So it kind of goes back to this: did the Russians actually do this? Now, there are a lot less nuclear weapons than they were in 1977, but they are still nuclear weapons, and they're strategic. So I don't have the answer, but it really goes into skepticism. When Russian President Putin talks about, and through the Ukraine war, about using nuclear weapons against London and Paris and the United States, and was one list after another. Is this something they really have available in place? Have they done the correct staffing work? Are they really able to do this again? Or was it always there and they never made it public? I don't have the answer. My skepticism is it took the U.S. 5 years to do this, and maybe the Russians don't have to take as much time. Again, we're also talking about fewer weapons than we had in late 1970s, early 1980s. So the question is, this skepticism of what the Russians are doing, or have they never been genuine about what their actual nuclear plans are? Now, they don't have to be. It's their their business, but it goes in the skepticism of has this always been an option that they would seek to as Russia is viewed weaker, that the only thing they really truly have is nuclear weapons, and maybe they foresaw that they actually have to, at some point, their strategic nuclear forces are going to be their linchpin to keep them from being destroyed. And even Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, has stated that a nuclear power has never lost a war, and that is true. So again, I'm going to the framework of, in the U.S.'s experience of updating to create a flexibility option within the strategic nuclear forces, how does that fit into what the Russians are doing? So the other part is that Jimmy Carter lays out here is he talks about a U.S. nuclear strategy. Again, we're talking about strategic nuclear forces and a reserve force. Remember, the reserve force was the one that has to be substantial enough to attack urban and industrial targets. That's what makes up the reserve force. To some extent, there's also a reserve force of if in an escalatory crisis, of how can you do with nuclear weapons. So we're going to go into the idea of the reserve force. Again, we're talking about a timeline from 1977 to 1982. The directive was actually, PD 59 was in 1980 to cover a timeline up to 1982. So let's look at what weapons were available for the U.S. So the substantial reserve force, including submarines, strategic bombers, and the mobile version of the MX, which actually never came to be. The MX, which was the Peacekeeper missile, did come into account, but when it was first put out there, it was actually supposed to be a mobile missile system and not a one that was sitting in hardened silos. And the idea with the mobile one is that you can do a counter force attack against ICBMs. Because remember, the only weapon systems that were actually able to do counter force targeting was the ICBM. Those were the only ones that considered accurate enough, and strategic bombers. Submarines at this time were not available to do counter force. So the reserve force was initially intended, when you start reading through here, is because the mobile version of the MX wasn't available. So we go into, what's available? Well, you have the, we'll go in there about the weapon systems in there. So the reserve force, when they initially created the idea, was to attack counter value targeting, threaten the Soviet Union's population to end the war, even in a nuclear reserve. That was always that trump card. So again, the document mandated an increase in the reserve force through 1982 to suppress the current countervalue targeting and bolster countervailing strategy, which again, that is attacking the things that are most valuable to the leaders of the Soviet Union. So the idea is that the U.S. is preparing for the idea of a prolonged nuclear war. By the fact is that they would use something in their pocket to do countervalue and countervailing strategies as the part of the reserve force. Now, the weapons that are available in the time frame of the directive, 1980 to 1982, were limited, with only land-based ICBMs being available. Now, you can assume when you're talking about a reserve force, for the most part, your ICBMs are going to have been used up or possibly destroyed. So you're talking about in this time frame, you're talking about Minuteman II, Minuteman III, Titan II missiles. MX was not available yet. And the idea is that also the MX eventually, when it came out, it was going to be following under the same idea of these other land-based Minuteman II, Minuteman III, and Titan II. It was going to be in a hardened silo. So the idea is, if you're talking about the time frame of an objective, is that at this point, maybe your ICBMs have largely been used or they've been destroyed. So now that goes in there is that, okay, all your ICBMs are off the board. That leaves, in the case of, let's look in here, is the Carter administration had canceled the B-1A Lancer high-altitude supersonic bomber, strategic bomber, in 1977. Remember, this was written in 1980. The B-2 Spirit was actually on the drawing board, but was experiencing significant delays. So all of a sudden, when you talk about the idea of something that's countervailing, is your submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which are going to be your Poseidon and your Trident 1C4 missile, are not available for that type of mission because they just lack the accuracy. The B-1A was canceled in 1977. The B-2 was experiencing delays and would not be available anywhere near 1982. So the only weapon system available to conduct countervailing missions that were designated in the plan or in the directive was the B-52H Stratofortress. So when you go in there, the only weapon systems that are available to do all three counter force, countervalence, and countervalue, the only systems that were only available to do all three were Minuteman II, Minuteman III, Titan II, and the B-52H strategic bomber. So you're going in here, and the idea is that, okay, if you go into your countervalue assaults, that means your Minutemans are used. That only leaves to do all other attack options laid out in PD 59 is the B-52H. So we go in there, and the idea is an aspirational strategy of countervailing. There was a clear gap in be able to do this because you assume your ICBMs are going to be used for countervalue or destroyed in a counterforce attack. So they're only available in a counterforce attack, or they were destroyed in a counterforce first strike or possibly second strike. So there was no weapons outside the B-52H to be able to support the reserve methodology that was getting there, again, directing towards countervailing. So the only option that was to use these B-52H, which means also their bases had to be intact and the bombers had to be available. Obviously, a lot were going to be shot down. Soviets had a significant air defense system, so you could expect that a lot of those B-52Hs were going to be destroyed or not make it back. And then your bomber bases would have to have survived, most likely. Again, the Russians or the Soviets did not have a significant bomber fleet like the United States. So the bomber bases would have been targeted to rush by Soviet ICBMs. So would those bomber bases have survived? So countervailing had a big gap on it, be able to how it could do this, and will not be addressed till later on when the Trident II was available in 1990. So the Trident II D5 submarine was the first time that a SLBM had the range and the accuracy to do something other than counter value targeting. So B2 wasn't available. B1B did not get, which actually went from a high altitude supersonic strategic bomber to a low altitude strategic bomber that for the most part flew at subsonic speeds. That wasn't available till well into the Reagan administration. So you're talking about it did not come online, I think, until the mid 1980s. So again, it comes up with this whole review, and there's a significant gap in the idea of targeting and the idea of using a reserve force for something other than just counter value, and there were not the weapons for the most part available to do it outside of B-52H Stratofortress. So again, the B-52 at that time was, you're talking about 1977, it was 20-something years old. It's supposed to fly to almost 100 years old. It was still a powerful weapon, but it was not the leading edge weapon. And again, its bomber bases were vulnerable to counter force attacks from the Soviet Union. So again, maybe they wanted to do countervailing in some type of escalatory move, or some type of limited warfare. But again, a significant gap in being able to do this, unless countervailing became a first strike option where ICBMs could be available to be used. But we're not talking about this because he's talking about the reserve force. Though I talked about in last week's paper is they were leaving the options of a U.S. first strike. So that is it about the biggest part is, the question is, did the Russians, when they changed their document, was taking the U.S. example, is the Russian change in their doctrine legitimate? Was it always in place, or is it a bluff? And the other one is when NSC PD-59 became available, is there was a significant gap in the weapons available to make it a operational plan, at least for the idea of reserves, or it had to create a real first strike option for the U.S. Part 3 will be available next week, so we'll be talking more about that one. So just my thoughts on that. Again, I'm not an expert. I did fascinating to read the documents from the Carter Library. So they are classified. They were classified documents. They are not classified anymore. Publicly available. So it was interesting reading the strategies around these. All right, so the next one is the West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 23, and it's under the headline of the idea of the Philippine Military Remodernization Project, which was formulated in 2022 and has really started gaining traction or starting traction in 2024 with the goal to spend $35 billion over the next decade. Now, the reason why this is available is the Philippines have been fighting a drug war and insurgency, mainly a communist insurgency, but there was also other additional insurgencies that occurred after 9/11, for example. And the Philippine government has made significant progress, and this is pre-Marcos as well, significant progress in reducing the abilities of these insurgencies, but not fully defeated them. But it's gotten to the point that the Philippines can start looking outward instead of inward. Now, I've argued in this paper, and it's not 100% true, but I think it's a significant factor, is the Philippines were very much focused inward on the insurgency and less on what was happening outside of the country, because again, they were tied up with this insurgency. Also, the prior president was tried to create a more favorable environment with China. And I would say that even he failed, felt like he had failed in this as he started kind of switching, becoming a little bit more friendly towards the U.S. and a little bit colder towards China after China was still ignoring President Duterte, his overtures to try to create a warmer cooperation with China over these issues in the South China Sea. Well, for President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., so the other part is, so I argue that two points have made this remodernization program available. One was the reduction in the insurgency and the government or the people electing President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who has been willing to confront China over its illegal claims in the Philippines exclusive economic zone. So it could come into a case is that, yes, President Marcos could go in there and say, okay, I want to be more aggressive towards China. I want to stand up for our sovereignty. I want to work more with international partners and interoperability exercises. But to do that, he had to to be able to effectively work in interoperability exercises and to offer something where the Philippines were a partner in addressing the issues of illegal Chinese claims in the Philippine EEZ, Exclusive Economic Zone, which comprised the West Philippine Sea. He had to be able to make the Philippines something more than just a strategic location for, let's say, the U.S. to operate on to counteract China's aggressive moods towards Taiwan. And the Philippines do play an important role because geographically, the U.S. sees that Philippine Islands would help in confronting the Chinese threat to Taiwan. But that doesn't necessarily settle the Philippines issue over their exclusive economic zone. So it was more of wanting to become a partner in this. Also, the Philippines have parts in their constitution. I may not fully understand all this. Is that not to have foreign countries fight for Philippine, basically fight Philippines wars. So the Philippines have taken more of a view of being independent or at least securing their own fate militarily. So if the Philippines wanted to be more than just a strategic location for, again, let's say, I'm not saying this has happened, but let's say the U.S. just was interested in getting access to Philippine Islands to confront China, well, that doesn't serve the Philippines' purpose, again, because they want to reestablish the sovereignty of their exclusive economic zone from China. So they had to get to a point where they had something to offer other than just strategic location. Now, strategic location plays a big part of it, but if they're supposed to be on, this makes it sound bad, and this is probably, call it quid pro quo light, where the Philippines are getting something out of this, but the allies are getting some, or the U.S. and Japan are getting something out of it as well, mainly access to strategic locations. But again, the Philippines need something out of this, and again, that's establishing their sovereignty over their zones. So this means that the outward looking, because again, the insurgencies have largely defeated, the outward focus of the Philippine military had to become more effective in modern warfare. It doesn't have to match China, but it has to be more modern oriented so that it can act within a framework of interoperability of the major allies in the region, which would be, again, United States, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and also when South Korea, India. They had to be able to create something a little bit more, and again, they're not doing interoperability so much with India, though they are doing some. Excuse me. The Philippines had to become a more substantial modern military, at least to the point that it could work with these modern military forces in the region. Basically, Philippines had to come up to some type of level of being more effective effective in the modern warfare area. So the one area that they started on was they went to India and signed a deal for the BrahMos supersonic cruise missile. This is an anti-ship cruise missile that can be fired from ships, it can be fired from land, it can be fired from air. Now, the funny thing about this is the BrahMos cruise missile, which is being sold to the Philippines from India with the idea of curbing the expansion of Chinese claims in the South China Sea by creating a weapon available. Again, that was jointly created between India and Russia and is sold to the Philippines to counter Russia's ally, China. So that was kind of interesting, but there's the Russians don't seem to be putting up too much of an argument about this. Of the Chinese are hopping mad about it, but they're not blaming the Russians for it, and they're not necessarily blaming the Indians either. They're blaming the wronged think of the Philippines. That's their description of it. So the Philippines started taking delivery of the BrahMos supersonic cruise missile, and they've been assigned to Philippine Marine units to operate from mainly land locations. And again, India offered these because they were concerned about the aggressive claims of China in trying to dominate the South China Sea. India is also in negotiations with Vietnam to sell the BrahMos cruise missile to them as well. So this was the first move, was to create some type of long-range weapon to counter the Chinese Navy, or the People's Liberation Army Navy plan, or PLAN. So the other one was the U.S. and Philippines had an exercise, I believe in April 2024. I don't remember the name of the exercise. It was after Balikatan. The U.S. Philippines had a exercise, and the U.S. Army deployed a Typhoon mobile missile battery in northern Luzon Island in the Philippines. The idea is that there was a live fire exercise as part of this exercise in April. The Typhoon was not included in the live fire portion of the exercise, but it was to give experience to the U.S. of deploying the Typhoon missile system to a Philippine island. It was also allowed to give the Philippine Armed Forces a chance to work with this new weapon system. The idea is starting to work with modern weaponry. And the U.S. Was supposed to withdraw with the Philippines agreement, was withdraw the missile battery in September. It has been extended indefinitely, and the Chinese, again, are hopping mad about it. So I think Defense Minister Teodoro had stated this, and I'm actually going to pull up a direct quote. Is when when the Chinese Foreign Ministry complained about the Philippines deciding to keep the U.S. Army Typhoon missile system in Luzon, his response was, quote, "If the CCP is truly intent on reducing tensions and instability in the region, they should cease their saber rattling, stop their provocative actions, halt their interference in other countries' internal affairs, withdraw their illegal presence from the Philippines exclusive economic zone, and adhere to international law," end quote. And that was on December 24th, 2024. So the thing was about the internal affairs. If any country tries to bring up to China about their saber rattling and their threats of invading Taiwan, the Chinese always come back and say, it's an internal matter. We will not address this. It's an internal matter within China, which is BS. But it's funny that Teodoro has basically turned that argument on them, is that China can't tell us, in the Philippines, about what weapon systems they can and can't keep in their country. And China has thousands of missiles pointed all throughout the Western Pacific, coming from mainland China. And they have no issues pointing their missiles every which way they can and trying to threaten neighbors. But somehow when one missile battery is in there, the Chinese are very, very upset about this, and they have all types of insults that they direct towards the Philippines, and that's why I think Secretary Teodoro is awesome the way he responds to this. He's just not taking this Chinese stuff laying down. So they've also learned is coming from the Army Chief of Staff, not Bronner because he's the Chief of Staff of the total General Staff, is the Army Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Roy Galido, I think. Sorry, I can't exactly remember his name. Again, it's not on my notes. He admitted this week that the Philippines are in negotiations to acquire the Typhoon missile system for defense purposes as well. Now, it did not say how far along are they in this conversation, because he did say is the economics have to work out. So it seems like they are interested in acquiring these Typhoon missile systems. There's been nothing about negotiations. Now, earlier this year, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin went to the Philippines and gave a $500 million grant to, among other things, upgrade 7 bases that the Philippines opened up for joint operations with the U.S. I wrote this in a comment back to a listener who had a great question, and we had a good conversation going back and forth. Is when Subic Bay was the biggest U.S. Navy logistical hub, it was not a joint base. Either was Kubi Point Naval Air Station in the Philippines. These were U.S. exclusive bases. These were not joint bases with the Philippines. Again, they were U.S. bases. The now is, again, the U.S. withdrew from the agreement was that the Philippines did not want the U.S. naval base there anymore. The Cold War was over. U.S. withdrew it. Same with Kubi Point. But these new bases they're signing, and I think there's been 7. I think there's 14 total, relatively small, but there's 7. And unlike being just exclusive U.S. bases operated within the Philippines, these are joint bases. The U.S. gave $500 million to help upgrade it, and they said more money would come, but they didn't want to just flood a bunch of money in there that was be used inefficiently, because, again, if you make too much demand too quickly, prices rise, and you don't get the bang for the buck. But part of that $500 million was to be able to improve the security infrastructure of the Philippines so that it can handle advanced weapons. It can operate a joint operations center in conjunction with the U.S. That means it has to have a better security infrastructure. Keep those Chinese spies out, or North Koreans, or whoever. It had to be a better system. And a lot of these Typhoon missile negotiations are going to be based back on being able to create a better security infrastructure within the Philippines. And that's on the way. So it may not necessarily, as the Lieutenant General had stated, that yes, it's true that they haven't worked out the economics. There has to be an infrastructure update that the U.S. and the Philippines have already identified as a gap, something they're working to correct. I think before any Typhoon decision is ever made about selling the Typhoon missile system to the Philippines, is there will have to be a decision. There will have to be completion on the security infrastructure of the Philippines. Now, defense minister. So when there was said again about talking about this possible negotiations and the continued deployment, the Chinese Foreign Ministry got big mad again, and Defense Minister Gilberto Teodoro stated that any deployment and procurement of assets related to the Philippines security and defense fall in the sovereign prerogative and not subject to any foreign veto. So give the big finger to the Chinese. Again, the Philippines is a much smaller country, and the fact that they are being that direct towards the Chinese, and again, he's using a lot of the rhetoric that the Chinese use against other countries that criticize China. He's using the exact type of language that the Chinese use towards other. he's turning around and using it on them. And the Chinese look nothing but hypocritical. They don't have a problem looking hypocritical because somehow they think they're above reproach. But it's funny to see him do that, and he is not afraid to do it. Makes me wonder if he's got bigger plans in his future, meaning maybe the president or vice president of the Philippines. Yet to be determined. Again, it always seemed like Sarah Duterte was going to be the most likely be the next president, but her future after that death threat of the president, the vice president, the wife, the Speaker of the House, and the investigation. Again, I'm not speaking into the political aspects of the investigation. I know like politics are politics, and I know that sometimes opposition research often gets blown up into something very, very minor gets blown up. But the fact she did threaten the president, the vice president, the first lady, and the president, Speaker of the House, the first lady of the Philippines, with an assassination if something happened to her, that's a pretty big deal. So I don't know if she's going to be available. So it makes me wonder if Defense Minister Teodoro is kind of setting himself up as a possible presidential or vice presidential candidate when President Marcos's term is up. Now, the Philippines are also in the process of negotiating and maybe in the steps of purchasing Swedish fighter jets. They're not the most advanced versions of the Swedish fighter jets, but they are looking at Swedish fighter jets. They're looking at buying patrol ships and warships from South Korea, which including anti-submarine corvettes, early warning systems and modern Coast Guard ships from Japan, and submarines from France. Now, it does make me wonder with submarines from France is when AUKUS Pillar 1 came out, where the U.S. and the United Kingdom were to produce nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. Australia was already under a contract to fulfill, have diesel submarines provided to it by France. So I'm wondering if this French move is part of basically just shifting the French capabilities or their production capacity further or closer to China, where maybe they feel like diesel-powered submarines would be more effective being closer inland to China than being from Australia. I'm just guessing, but the fact is that French submarines are back on the board in the Pacific. It does make me wonder if there's an agreement to smooth over things, because that was a big deal when the Australians had to cancel those contracts with the French under the U.S. and British. That was very controversial to the French. And I think that maybe there's something to be said about the fact that the French submarines are back on the board just further north into the Pacific. Just a guess. Just a guess. Now, the political goal of the Philippines is to uphold sovereignty against China, and again, to join a coalition to counteract the aggressive goals of the CCP and to be Chinese Communist Party. And to be able to do that, they had to be able to improve the capability of its military on an outward focus to be able to operate effectively within these interoperability exercises and be able to provide something to make themselves valuable to the more to the militaries, that it would become it would be a partner and not just a just offering its strategic assets by its location. So that was a relatively short paper. And again, I only had 2 papers this week, so this will be a shorter than normal conversation on this. I thought it was interesting to see that this remodernization program and where the directions are going to go with the Philippines, and just how duplicative the Chinese statements are towards the Philippines, and how Defense Minister Teodoro is just very publicly just throws it back into their face. Again, the maybe the Chinese act obtuse about it and don't realize it. I think they're just ignoring it, but it's clear that they are. Uh, um, he's using their own words and their own, we'll call it political strategy. He's using it right back in their faces. So that is it for this week. Thank you for everybody that's listening. It was funny that I lost 3% of my followers, 3.5% of my followers over one paper that I did about Ukraine peace talks. Up until today, I still had not even made up that 3%. Almost 2.5 weeks later, looks like I finally broke even. So it took me quite a while. That means my growth rates are about 3% every. Basically call it 1% every week increase. So kind of reestablished what I did. I'm still trying to figure out because I wasn't rah-rahing on either side or another. You call it the effect of Trump has changed. President-elect Trump has changed the conversation of the Ukraine war. People could argue it's good or bad, but he has broken the political stalemate of talking about what peace looks like. Apparently that just did not go over with a lot of people. Not even going in there rah-rah, just talking about just the actual facts of the ground and how it was just so. I didn't get a lot of comments, but again, the day after it was posted, I lost 3.5% of my followers in overnight, and I'm still. So I'm getting about. I was at 339. I dropped down quite a bit, and so I'm just back at 338 now, and of that, I'm trading off to get back all those numbers. I'm trading for every 2 I get, I'm losing 1. So I'm struggling to get the numbers back up, but it's coming, so it's okay. It was just funny that I can't figure out exactly why that happened. All I could think of is I get it. The emotions are high versus Trump, which I think they're extremely overblown. I've talked about several people on this, and so, but yeah, apparently it just did not go over well. So I'm back up to about where I was at before that. So we'll see how it goes, and we'll see as of how many more people just decide to rage quit. Which again, that's their choice to do. If they don't like what I'm doing, that's fine. It's not like they're leaving insults. It's not like that. If they leave because they don't like what they're reading, that is fine. There's plenty of good locations to read. I hope they don't go to echo chambers, but it's not my problem. I'm not owed any members, subscribers, followers. I'm not owed any of those. I have to earn them. And I have to make those decisions as am I going to talk about or not talk about certain things. And I'm not going to change what I'm talking about. I have the historians talk about is there's a difference between the past and history. I have my own historiography about how I approach problems. I have my own biases. I understand that. I don't hide that fact, but I do try to keep an open mind. But again, I'm not changing the way I do things just to appease one audience or another. Again, I have my point of view. I have what I think is the correct decisions. They will sometimes come through the paper, but I try to be balanced in my approach to problems and be honest, because I don't think we can get better by not being honest about what's a good idea, what's a bad idea, what's a mistake, what's a win, what's a working strategy. You have to be honest, even no matter what side you work on, because you're being dishonest, you will never come to the right, in my opinion. Maybe you can fall into it once or twice into the right decision. In the end, you're not going to be as effective because you are avoiding calling things untruthful on things that you may not like. You have to basically have to face up to those, and I will continue to write in that aspect. So again, I'm not owed anybody's likes. I'm not owed anybody's subscription or following or followers on or in other platforms. I'm not owed it. I just have to earn it. And I will continue to do what I can earn it within my boundaries of what I think is the right way, my approach to things. I know there's better approaches to it than me, but I'm going to stick true to what I believe is the right way and what works for me in trying to explain a message. So I want to thank everybody that's new to this channel this week. Thank you for listening in. All those who have been with me throughout this journey, thank you for joining again. Thank you for your continued support. It is greatly appreciated. Drop me a line on Substack if you have any questions. I've had some good conversations. I will take time to answer questions and approaches and how I think. Give you more approaches, and you don't have to be a paid subscriber for me to do so. Though it would be nice to have more paid subscribers because, again, this is not a completely free operation. I'm also, this week, I've also started out on Podbean. I don't expect anything much coming out of that. It's just another area for my podcast to be available. So it is New Year's week starting tomorrow. I hope all of you have a great New Year, a happy New Year. If you are into making New Year's resolutions, make it a good one and stick to it. I am not a big New Year's resolution fan. Not the fact that there's no reason not to self-improve. I'm a big believer in that. I just don't wait for the new year to make it happen. I just decide, okay, let's do it now. But if you're big into New Year, I get it. Fresh start, new approach, great. If you are into making resolutions, make it a good one, make it a positive one in your life, and stick to it. All right. So I hope all of you have a happy New Year. Thank you for listening in. Next week will be basically the same type of format of this week. There will not be a long paper, which I call my main papers. There will not be one on New Year's Day. I'll probably just do a short paper along with a follow-on video of it. But so there'll only be 2 big papers this week. So again, same format. And then after the New Year's, we'll be back at it as normal. So I hope all of you have a happy New Year's. Thank you for listening, and we will talk to you next week. Thank you. Bye.